So in the introduction, we learned about the Tunisian simple stitch, TSS, the purl stitch, and the knit stitch. And last week we used all three of those stitches to make our blocks. We also talked about binding off and then attaching behind those bind off stitches. So this week we are going to learn another new stitch before we get into our blocks. So this stitch is called the Tunisian reverse stitch. It is very similar to the TSS, the simple stitch. So the simple stitch, we insert our hook through that vertical loop, yarn over, and pull up a loop. That's the simple stitch. Reverse stitch is exactly the same, only instead of picking up the loop on the front, we pick up the vertical loop on the back. So to show you on the video, if I hold it separately like that, you can see the front loop and this back loop peeking through. So we want to put our hook in back of our work and go around or through that back vertical loop to pick up our loop. So from the back, picking up. So it's still under the vertical loop, except our hook is working from the back and going through the back loop instead of the front loop. So we'll just work our way down this side here, picking up. We'll pick up 13 of these loops, and the first loop will give us 14, and then I'll show you the border stitch as well for a total of 15 loops for our swatch. So again, this will give a little bit of a different texture or look from the front. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. The border loop we will pick up as usual, going through both of those side loops and pulling up. And then we'll work our return pass. So our usual return pass is pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2 all the way. Last week, remember, I did show you an alternate where you can yarn over and pull through 2 right away, and it just closes that hole just a little bit between the border stitch and our next stitch. So we work the return pass all the way down the row, and we're going to work a few rows of this reverse stitch. So that first one can be a little bit tricky to find, to maneuver your way behind. So you just want to make sure that you snug up this first loop after you find that first one, because it will sometimes stretch and it'll be really loose, which we don't like. And here's an example of one of my loops that I didn't tighten, and you can see how it's a lot larger than my other side loops and not as neat. So the reverse stitch again, just like TSS, only we're working on the back side of those stitches and picking up that back vertical loop. Okay, if you did the pull through 2 right away, make sure you get that last stitch before the border stitch as well, that we don't miss that one. And then we'll work our return pass. And that's the TRS, Tunisian reverse stitch. So you can work a few more rows of that until you're comfortable with that. So far on our swatch, our stitches have all been a very solid fabric that we create. And a lot of people typically associate that with Tunisian crochet, that it's very solid and dense fabric. We're now going to learn a couple of techniques to have a bit more open spaces in our Tunisian crochet, or to form, or these stitches can be used to form an au jour which means a lace pattern. So we will be using these in our week 2 blocks as well. So the first one is a very simple one. We TSS in the first stitch, and then we yarn over and skip the next stitch. TSS in the next, yarn over, skip the next. So the yarn over is the loop of where we're skipping, and then you can already see how that creates a bit of an open space or hole in our work. So always skipping the stitch, yarn over, skip the stitch. Oops, I didn't skip the stitch. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pull up a loop. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pull up a loop. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pull up a loop. And then we'll pick up our border stitch as well. Then we'll work our return pass. Now, what we need to be careful on our return pass is that that yarn over counts as a loop. So we pull through 2, and that was the yarn over, pull through 2, and that was the TSS. Pull through 2. Okay, so I worked fairly loosely on this round. Sometimes it can get stretched out a fair bit, so you want to be careful to keep your stitches that your hook slides but not too loose as well. Now to work the following row, so we can already see how that's much more opened up and not near as solid a work as we've had previously. So depending on the pattern what we want to do as we work the next row, sometimes we will work into the space that is created to pull up our next loop. Sometimes we will actually work into the yarn over or the return pass, so that chain to pick up our loop at the top, and so on. And sometimes you actually pick up the yarn over loop and pull it up. So it just depends on what we're doing for the next row. For what we're doing here, so next we're just going to insert our hook into this large hole that was created when we did the yarn over. It's like a Tiki S or the knit stitch, because you can see the front of the yarn over loop and the back behind, and where we enter is between the two of those. So we just pull up a loop in that hole, TSS in the next. Okay, so likewise on this row we want to be very careful with our tension. I can tell that I worked my first row quite loosely and the holes are a little bit bigger than we want. So we will get used to that tension as we work a few extra practice rows before we get to our square. So we were just TSS in each of the stitches across and picking up a loop in the hole that was created by the yarn over. And regular return pass. And then the next row again would be where we make the yarn overs to create that open or lace section. So TSS in that first stitch, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS in the next stitch, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS, yarn over, oops, I missed one, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS, yarn over, skip, TSS in that last stitch, and then pick up our border stitch and return pass. And then the next row again is like row 2 where we TSS there, pick up a loop in the space. TSS, pick up a loop in the space. So you can continue that down the row. And then each row, remember, just works a regular return pass. And so it's a 2-row pattern to get to this effect. But you can see how it's much more open and lacy effect than our previous stitch patterns have been. So you can work that a few more times until you're comfortable. If you don't have a couple rows of TSS at the end of your swatch, you may want to go work those a couple rows of the simple stitch to prepare for our next stitch learning. So block 7 is going to be designed using the stitch, the star stitch. It's quite a pretty stitch to work. So we just want to practice this. It's a 2-row repeat. So to start, we're going to insert our hook under the next 3 bars and pull up a loop. So we'll have 2 loops on our hook, yarn over, which gives 3 loops on the hook, and we're going to insert our hook under those exact same 3 bars that we did in the first step and pull up a loop, which then gives us the 4 loops on our hook. We'll continue that down the row. So hook goes under 3 loops, pull up a loop, yarn over, under the same 3 loops, and pull up another loop. We'll work that down the row, always remembering to go back under those same 3 loops. So pull up a loop, yarn over, under the same 3 loops, and pull up another loop. And then we'll just make a TSS to finish off, and then our border stitch. Okay, so we should still have our 15 stitches. When we do the return pass, you'll need to be careful to just work one of these at a time off. So we're still going to be pulling through 2 stitches. We just have to be careful when there's the 3 grouped close together that we just go through one of those loops at a time and continue that return pass down the row. Okay, and that's the first step. They don't quite look like stars yet, so this next row is very important to help it turn into more of a star shape. So it's just a regular TSS row, but as we work under these loops and pull them up, the star shape starts to take more shape. And because mine's sort of over 2 rows, you don't see it quite as clearly, but you can see how the star shape is forming between those 2 rows. And then just TSS the last stitch in the border stitch. Okay, so we'll do the return pass, and then we'll try those 2 rows again. So under 3 vertical bars, pull up a loop, yarn over, hook under those same 3, pull up another loop, and continue that down the row. And one more time. And the return pass. And always remembering on that return pass, being careful that we don't pull off too many loops in that pull through. And then working that TSS row next to help form, as we pull these loops and sort of separate them a bit, it'll help form that star shape in the loops. And then if you wish, you can continue to work a few more rows of the star stitch, remembering that it's a 2-row pattern to complete the stitch, and working your return pass as well on that until you feel quite comfortable with the star stitch, as we're using that in block 7.